Awesome. So I'm really excited to welcome everyone back for a very exciting session. I know that post-lunch sessions can be a bit, uh, can start a bit slow, but I think we're going to have a bit of a exciting session because we have a not only a talk but a very experiential session because we have a tasting of the crackers that Gabriella and her team have developed. So I'm really excited to introduce Gabriella D'Cruz, the founder of the Good Ocean. I have actually seen Gabriella work as an eco warrior and as a defender of the forests and a brilliant campaigner. And I've just really admired her work for all these years. And very recently, had the opportunity to attend a workshop conducted by her on the opportunities of seaweed in the culinary space, and I was so mind blown that we tried a couple of different uh, preservation techniques that they had tried and sort of developed for the culinary space, and I definitely felt like I was tasting the future, and which is why I'm super excited that she's here to talk to all of us, because all of us do care about food systems transformation, and sort of like always are excited about novel sources of protein, also making it very local, ethically sourced. I think these are values that we all care about, and that was something that really came out for me from the workshop that I had attended of Gabriella's. And super excited to have her speak to all of us. So over to you, Gabriella.
Thank you, Shreya, for that introduction. It's also been really lovely working with you on the Amche Mola campaign, which is where we know each other from. And I'm really glad that you liked our tasting session at Serendipity. And thank you, Vinny, for organizing the back end with the presentation. Today's presentation was supposed to be about making seaweed or ethical protein irresistible. And I think that each of you will understand the task at hand when it comes to changing behavior, when it comes to food, especially when it's flavors that people are not used to. And so I'm going to stick with a more appropriate title, which is Eating Seaweed. And it's essentially about the work that I do creating a seaweed food company, how I got into eating seaweed myself, and also the ethics and environmental concerns about this. As well as potential seaweed futures, like what in India can we look forward to when it comes to eating seaweed in the future. And hopefully at the end of this conversation, and I'm hoping to have more of a conversation in the Q&A section, I can perhaps get more of you interested in seaweed and even eating seaweed yourself. I started The Good Ocean. It's India's first seaweed food company a few years ago. We currently wild harvest seaweed from the coast of India, and we supply it B2B to restaurants. I have a background in marine conservation, and I've worked in the conservation sector for about 10 years. And I personally got quite disillusioned with the fact that a lot of conservation efforts remain on paper. And so I decided to start a company and look at ways in which conservation can be carried out through sustainable business. But the more I work in the field of sustainable business, the more I realize that it's sometimes an oxymoron, and it's really difficult to constantly stick by sustainability. There are many challenges, and there's also a lot of greenwashing. But The Good Ocean has been around for 2.5 years now, and I will talk to you a little more about what we do and more about seaweed in India. Can I have the next slide? So what we essentially, the company essentially revolves around wild harvesting seaweed across the Indian coastline. And we specialize in making sure that it's food safe and storable, and sell it to restaurants that then use it in high-end food products. Can I have the next slide? These are some of the examples in which local Indian seaweed has been used. So it's dried, and the image on the left is essentially what it looks like dried. Chefs then use it to make a variety of products. Some of them make seaweed salads out of them, broths or stock. We've got chefs that have made seaweed pani puri, a variety of different Indian food products from seaweed, basically trying to incorporate it into Indian cuisine. And that's essentially the role that we play as the only seaweed food company in India. And we currently launched our first B2C product, which is the cracker that you might have already tried. It's a vegan, gluten-free cracker that we've developed in collaboration with Atmosphere Studios. Can I have the next slide? And they are essentially the first seaweed snack in India that's produced from locally sourced seaweed. So at this point, you're probably wondering where we get seaweed in India, how many species we have, what is the history around seaweed in India. And can I have the next slide, please? And essentially, I'd like to start with introducing you. Maybe we can turn the volume off. So this is an underwater video that I took of some of the seaweed forests that we harvest from. I'm sorry, it's a bit shaky. My underwater video skills are not great, but essentially this is what a seaweed forest in India looks like. This is a species called sargassum. It's a brown species of seaweed. It's very similar to kelp, if you're familiar with kelp or kombu. And these seaweed species grow quite abundantly along the west coast of India, as well as in some parts on the east coast of India. And they are some of the most important biodiversity hotspots for the ocean. Much like coral reef ecosystems, they sequester carbon. They are essentially areas where fish breed and feed, and they're also supporting a huge amount of our fish stocks. And it's really not accounted for when it comes to the conservation value of seaweed forests. Coral reefs tend to get a lot more conservation value. Seaweed forests are, for the most part, completely invisible in the conversation around conservation in India. And yeah, this is essentially one look at what a seaweed forest looks like. We have 800 species of seaweed in India. They are of different forms, flavors, textures, and they have different seasons. Much like land plants, seaweeds also have seasonality in the oceans. Can I have the next slide? Maybe it's running again. Yeah, there's huge diversity of seaweed forests in India. This is just one example of them. And what we... Sorry, I will just wait for the next slide. Great. Essentially what it looks like is maybe back to two before. Yes, perfect. This is the basic structure of a seaweed plant, if you may call it. Essentially, seaweeds come from two different kingdoms, Plantae as well as Protista, depending on which species. They are not animals. And essentially, they are marine algae. And they are characterized by the lack of a root. So if you see anything in the ocean that doesn't have a root, that's essentially seaweed. If it does have a root, then the likelihood that it is seagrass, which is not marine algae. This particular species that you just saw in the video is called sargassum. It's one of India's most prolific species of seaweed. It grows abundantly along our coastline, and it's characterized by a holdfast, which is a root-like structure, leaves or fronds, and these tiny little round globular structures called holdfasts. And the holdfasts essentially help the seaweed to grow upwards and access sunlight easily. Can I have the next slide? One of the biggest differences, if you're familiar with seaweed at all, is that if you are in a cold water ecosystem, seaweeds grow much larger. If you're in the tropics, they grow much smaller, which could also be another reason why they have been quite elusive for many years. If you do go to the coast, you will usually see seaweed when it's washed up on the beach. But if you are a swimmer, if you swim anywhere around a rocky outcrop, you will find seaweed forests pretty much anywhere along the coast in India. And now around December till March or April is the best time to go out and experience these seaweed forests in the ocean. Next slide, please. Along the coast in Goa, the seaweed forests grow quite tall, 12 to 13, sometimes 15 feet long, and they have huge biomass. which eventually, once they break off, floats into the deeper parts of the ocean and does contribute to carbon sequestration. So they're really a very important oceanic resource that we really should be paying more attention to. Next slide. These are some of the species we have. As I said before, we have 800 species of seaweed. They differ in terms of color, flavor, texture. They're largely categorized into brown seaweeds, red seaweeds, and green seaweeds. And the ones we see on the top are sargassum, which is the most abundantly available. Then you've got dictyota, which is in the middle. It's a digitate-like seaweed. It has a more bitter flavor profile. Towards the right, we have a species called Padina, called sea fan. It looks like a little fan underwater, and hence its name. Again, has a very bitter flavor profile, but is supposed to have a lot of very bioactive compounds that are used. Actually, the most recently one that we found is that it has a natural sunscreen property that's quite interesting to some people. Then we have the ulvas, which is Ulva prolifera on the bottom left, another form of species that's eaten in Korea. It's called gamte. The middle one is called spatoglossum. It's a very rare species of seaweed that is actually tastes like raw mango. And on the extreme right of the bottom, we have ulva, which is a species of green seaweed, again used quite extensively in the culinary space, mainly in salads. Next slide. Great. If you've consumed any one of these products today, yesterday, and the last month, then you've actually consumed seaweed without knowing it. So even though seaweed has this diversity of flavor, texture, color, ecosystems that it grows in, this is usually what it ends up in supply chains in India. So because seaweed is a non-bovine gelatin, it is used in a range of products that require foaming, gelatin additives, or any stabilizing effects. And so toothpaste has a gel from seaweed called carrageenan. Ice cream has a gel from seaweed called agar-agar. Cough syrups have sodium alginate, which is another gel from seaweeds. Seaweeds are also used to clarify alcohol, such as beer, and they're used in foaming agents, such as in your shaving cream or in fire extinguishers. Can I have the next slide? And essentially what it looks like is something like this. Once the seaweed has been processed, you extract certain gels out of it, and then those gels will be used in a variety of FMCG products on a day-to-day basis. In India, this industry is mainly supported and built on the backs of a lot of women. Can I have the next slide? These are the 3 gels that you get from seaweed. If you just hit 3 times, it'll all pop up. Carrageenan, sodium alginate, and agar. You might have heard of them if you work in the food industry, or if you do develop any products, or if considering a lot of vegan people consume non-bovine gelatin, the odds are you are actually consuming seaweed quite often. Next slide, please. So there are over 700 to 800 women in coastal Tamil Nadu that supply this seaweed to the Indian subcontinent. Seaweed grows in abundance in an area called the Gulf of Mannar, which is in between India and Sri Lanka. And the seaweed that is grown there is wild harvested mainly by women from coastal communities. And they've been doing it for the last 30, 40 years. The women generally start when they are about 10 years old, and there are women in their 80s that are still taking part in this industry. The seaweed that is harvested is mainly the brown seaweed species called Sargassum or Turbinaria, and the gels extracted go into cough syrups, any kind of foaming agent, and at times also food products. The main reason why women engage in this industry is because it is one of the lowest paying industries along the coast. However, it's accessible to them. So they make around 4 to 5 rupees per wet kg of seaweed, which is quite a low price considering the value of seaweed in the food market, for example. But because seaweed goes into the hydrocolloid or gel markets, generally the prices are quite low for coastal communities. So this is something that I was really interested in looking at in terms of coastal ecosystems and how they support communities. And when I met the women many years ago, the conversation that I had with them was that a lot of people well-meaning people come in to try and help them with their industry, but no one really does anything about changing the price. And so I was curious to see whether seaweed in India could be priced higher, and if that could create a difference in the amount of revenue earned by coastal communities. And starting a food company was one way of doing this. While we work primarily in Goa and we would like to work with coastal community members in Tamil Nadu, it's quite challenging. And so the seaweed harvesters that we pay in Goa are paid 10 times more than any seaweed harvester in Tamil Nadu because we are able to access higher value markets such as food. But when it comes to hydrocolloids, which are low value markets, it's a little more challenging. And so there is this opportunity here when we look at the seaweed value chain and we look at it through a food lens to offer coastal communities more of an income that both benefits the end user in terms of a good quality seaweed product, but also benefits coastal communities and the hard work that they do. Can I have the next slide, please? Another concern is harvesting. In general, because of climate change, we are seeing a decline in seaweed forests. We're also seeing the seaweed forests fluctuate when it comes to their growth patterns. And we don't have enough data to know why this is or how we can stop it. And also because of wild harvesting in general, seaweed is decreasing. There is a way to do it sustainably, but a lot of it is not very managed. And so that becomes a challenge as well. And so the trick really moving forward when it comes to building the seaweed industry and using seaweed as a food is figuring out how we can produce seaweed sustainably and in large enough quantities to supply growing markets. Next slide, please. And that's where the conversation around regenerative aquatic foods comes along. If you look at the fishery sector in general, there is an extractive trend. Usually you have fish that are harvested from the ocean. Quite a lot of it is through exploitative means like bottom trawling or trawling large schools of fish. And when it comes to seaweed, you have the opportunity to not just extract, but actually give back to the ocean. When you grow seaweed farms, perhaps in collaboration with mussel farms, generally the biodiversity in the ocean improves. There is more carbon sequestration, and fish stocks are supported more because fish feed on seaweed and breed in seaweed forests. And so there's a huge opportunity here to change the conversation around how we engage with seafood when we bring seaweed into the picture. It is really a way of transforming fisheries ecosystems from extractive into regenerative ones, and actually leaving the ocean better than before. Next slide, please. This is one example. When you have a seaweed and mussel farm, you have the ability to not only have two products that coastal communities can sell, but both seaweeds and mussels contribute very positively to the oceanic environment. Mussels clean a lot of sediment in the ocean, and seaweeds, of course, decrease a lot of carbon and acidification in the ocean. Next slide. When it comes to farming techniques, there are two ways in which you can farm seaweed. One is you can grow it out in the open ocean on raft systems, and the other is a more controlled way of growing it on a land-based system. Raft systems are much less expensive and can involve a lot more coastal community members because there's a larger section of ocean to work with, whereas land-based systems are usually restricted to an individual that owns land. And so generally when it comes to ownership, when it comes to value created for coastal communities, there's less of an incentive to set up a land-based system because land is more scarce than the ocean. However, it's a really good system to start if you want high-value seaweed products, and if coastal communities do have cooperative land or can pull together resources. It is a system that in the future could work to not only benefit coastal communities, but also create very high-value seaweed products for the Indian market, as well as for export potentially. Next slide. Yep, that's fine. And essentially what it entails is growing or collecting wild stock, sporulating it in a hatchery or a lab-based system, growing it out in tanks, and then eventually harvesting and processing it. However, no one has commercially farmed seaweed on land in India yet. There are 2 or 3 individuals that I know of that are currently in the process of developing farming systems on land. However, it is challenging, and farming systems in the ocean are also being developed more actively, but I can talk about that more in the Q&A sections in terms of what the challenges are. Next slide. And as I said before, when it comes to seaweed, you have low value markets such as the hydrocolloids and biofertilizers that offer a lower price. And that's just the nature of the industry, because the industry also doesn't sell it as an expensive product. However, if you do look at food, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, there is a possibility of increasing the value of the seaweed and benefits to coastal communities. And that's just something to consider when it comes to the future of seaweed in India. Next slide. When it comes to food specifically, there are a variety of ways in which you can include seaweed in diets. I will say here that there is very little evidence to show that coastal communities in India use seaweed as a traditional food source. There isn't enough data to know, and so we cannot say point blank that nobody uses it. There are communities in coastal Kerala as well as Tamil Nadu that do incorporate the gels from seaweed into certain food products. They make halwa out of it. Some use it as a vegetable and cook it like a vegetable. However, there is not, considering the length of our coastline and the use of fish and seafood and crustaceans in our cuisine, there really isn't significant use of seaweed in our cuisine, in spite of the fact that we do have large seaweed reserves along almost every part of our coastline. However, if we do look at ways in which we can incorporate seaweed into diets, there are a few ways to do this. You can make a salt out of seaweed. This is either by infusing seaweed into salt that's already being used in salt pans, or you could also just dry seaweed and use it as a natural form of sodium, because seaweed does have high levels of salt already. It can be used as a pickle or something that could be pickled or fermented. There are also secondary components such as salads, soups, sauces in which seaweed could be used, and of course primary components such as a vegan burger patty or some other ways of including seaweed in carbs that we already have. So you could also incorporate into rotis as well as other carbohydrate forms to improve nutrition. Next slide. Seaweed does have a lot of good stuff going on with it. It has a relatively high percentage of protein. Of course, 10 to 30% of dry weight when it comes to seaweed, that's a lot of seaweed to intake. And so it doesn't quite compete with other products such as soy or chicken or beef in that sense. However, it does have a high enough protein content to be included as a protein source in the future once we figure out better ways of extracting this protein, as well as making it more bioavailable, as well as making it more digestible. However, the more interesting part of seaweed is its nutritional profile. It has a very high level of vitamins and minerals, and that's essentially because it's in the ocean. Anything in a medium that is full of vitamins and minerals will absorb a lot of it into its being. And so in general, seaweed has higher levels of vitamins and minerals as compared to land plants. And because of a lot of extractive agricultural systems, a lot of our nutrients are getting washed away in runoff and eventually making their way into the ocean. And that's actually where seaweed absorbs a lot of this, and is another reason why seaweeds are still very nutritious, whereas land-based systems or land-based plants are losing a lot of their nutritional profiles. Seaweed has very high levels of iodine, which is really important for brain development, but also high levels of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and other nutrients that are required for people who have deficiencies, as well as for normal functioning. There is a challenge, however, when it comes to heavy metals. Because seaweed absorbs a lot of what's in the medium that it's in, if there are heavy metals in the ocean or in the rock around where the seaweed is grown, it will end up in seaweed. And so it's a very important step to run tests when it comes to heavy metal quantities in seaweed and to make sure that it's food safe. The seaweed forests that we have in India are not seen all year round. And so in general, they don't have the time to bioaccumulate a lot of the heavy metals present in the ocean. And so we've not seen the seaweed that we produce has not had any issues with heavy metals. However, if you look at clams, mussels, certain fish that are bottom feeders, they tend to have high levels of heavy metals, or large fish such as sharks or tuna tend to accumulate heavy metals. And so a lot of species in the ocean do have heavy metals. Seaweed is one that does accumulate it, and we haven't seen it as a threat right now. However, if it is being consumed largely in India, there will have to be tests to make sure that it's tested before it gets out into the food market. Next slide. Here are some examples of how people have used seaweed when it comes to a food product. And in this case, they've specialized on the protein content. Aqua was a company based in California. They started a really fantastic seaweed burger company. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. However, when they did run it, it produced these burgers that were made primarily of kelp, or the cold water version of sargassum, which is the species that we have. And it had a relatively high protein content, was nutritious as well as satiating, because seaweed creates this feeling of feeling full because it's very high in nutrients. This was one example of a food product that was made that was quite successful when it started. Next slide. Another one is Umaru. It's a very interesting food company, again based in the US, where they make seaweed bacon. It is completely plant-based, made entirely of seaweed, and specifically a red seaweed. I think it's dulse, which has a very bacony, meaty flavor profile. Again, very high levels of nutrition, and it's currently being marketed in the US. However, there are, challenges when it comes to protein that is plant-based when it comes to creating the right flavor. However, this is one of the most up-and-coming companies right now. Can I have the next slide, please? And if we just do a ballpark comparison of where we're looking at when it comes to seaweed versus soy, because that seems to be one of the main products being used when it comes to non-animal based protein, there is still a lot seaweed has to do to really compete with what soy offers right now. We don't really have the levels of protein that are needed to have a full substitute, and it's not a complete protein unlike soy, which has all 7 amino acids, and it's not as digestible. And that's also to do with research that needs to be done on particular strains of seaweed. Some are more digestible than others, and also extracting of protein from seaweed to make it into a product rather than just eating seaweed whole. However, what it does have going for it is that it has a very high level of vitamins, minerals, and nutrients. And so even if it doesn't form a protein substitute, it could really contribute to adding nutrition to plant-based meats, and in general, supplementing nutritional loss when it comes to not consuming certain meats. And in that sense, it's very applicable. So for example, it could be used for meats such as seafood, where you have omega-3, EHA, DPA, and a lot of other nutrition that you would get from seafood. You can actually replace it with seaweed. And another reason why it's very important to consider it at some point of time is the environmental factor. Soy and other land-based forms of protein use a lot of irrigation, electricity, fertilizer, and a lot of it is petroleum-based. When it comes to seaweed, it grows in the ocean, it uses sunlight, it uses seawater, and it doesn't require a lot of mechanization to produce. And so in that sense, it's a very interesting future food that India could use and could develop should there be more incentive to farming it and developing food products from it. Next slide. And yeah, essentially what we need to do to enable that to happen is we have to work on flavor, diversity, and nutrition. Right now, we as a company only supply sargassum, which is one species of seaweed. However, chefs and people in general have reached out to ask about another range of seaweed species they can access, but it's all limited to whether we can farm it. If we do make other species of seaweed interesting and trendy, there is a risk of overharvesting them, and that's just not something you want to do. And so we need a lot more technology when it comes to working on diversifying the seaweed that we grow, but also flavor and nutrition in the seaweed that we already have. Food safety is another concern. A lot of people are concerned about our oceans and how polluted they are becoming. And we have to consider this when it comes to seaweed as food, because the ocean is a dynamic resource. It's very difficult to control whether you have an oil spill one day, or the levels of microplastics in one section of the sea, or whether there will be some industry that will come up along the coast and eventually pollute large sections of the sea. And so that's always a concern. When you have land-based systems, they're easier to control pollution levels. But in the ocean, whatever goes in through the rivers will eventually end up in the sea. And that is definitely a concern when it comes to food safety. Sustainability is always a concern. Seaweed is touted as this silver bullet solution to the climate crisis, which it really is not. There are many concerns around how it's grown, where it's grown, and also the ethics of farming seaweed, where coastal communities are sometimes left out of the conversation. And traceability is another big thing. When you want to ascertain the cleanliness of your seaweed, or how ethical or what your labor practices are when it comes to farming seaweed, you do need traceability, and that's something that needs to be built into the system. It's very, very difficult right now. If you had a tub of toothpaste and you wanted to see where the seaweed in your toothpaste came from, it's almost impossible to trace that down a supply chain. And so that's really something we need to know more of when it comes to creating new seaweed supply chains in India. And lastly is communication. As we have said in the conversation before, communication is really key to trying to get people to understand why we want to encourage more ethical, traceable, sustainable food sources. And that's something that we have been doing a little bit of work on, but it's quite exhausting talking about this and getting people convinced about it, and it will take time. I know that spirulina, for example, took 10 years to get to a point where people were buying it as a food product and were interested in it. And seaweed is just about reaching the Indian market as an interesting new food, and it's going to take decades before it becomes something that's normalized. But we as a food company are really interested in being part of setting this communication and getting more people interested in seaweed. Next slide. And one reason why I feel that seaweed as alternative protein will be here for a while is because you can use seaweed for a variety of different things. Unlike spirulina, which is a freshwater algae, there's limits to what you can use it for. It's very good with protein, but you can't make bioplastics out of spirulina. Seaweeds, on the other hand, have a diversity of uses. You can make bioplastics, you can make nutritional supplements, you can make animal feed, you can make ink that is non-petroleum based ink. You can make fiber that is biodegradable, food sources, cosmetics, and my favorite is actually medical implements. So you can make bandages that help wounds heal faster, because seaweed has a range of antimicrobial, antifungal properties that help wound healing. So because of this diversity of products that you can make from seaweed, there will be more investment into farming seaweed, processing seaweed, technology around seaweed. And so that creates the opportunity for food to build alongside these other industries that might actually, foot the bill for a lot of the R&D needed. And that basically allows it to develop over the course of years, but at least it will be around. And it doesn't have to be exclusionary in the end. It is possible to make seaweed accessible once we have more abilities to develop how we make a variety of food products from it. My favorite one is, of course, that we can make seaweed pickle. Everybody eats pickle in India, and it could be something that anyone from a coastal community to someone who lives in cities and towns could have access to in the future. Next slide. And just to end with a conversation around wild seaweed forests, and to basically call for more action around why we need to conserve these forests. So you might have a question around why we wild harvest if we want to conserve wild seaweed forests. And that's essentially because we don't have farming technology that can farm the seaweed just yet. We do very small batch harvesting. However, in the future, there is a lot of need to reforest large parts of the ocean. A really, really brilliant example of how this is happening is by using something called green rocks. Essentially, this particular organization grows little baby seaweed on rocks and then just takes a boat out and throws them into the ocean, and that essentially seeds new seaweed forests. And this is one example of how people across the world are not only building seaweed supply chains and markets, but they're also working on conserving seaweed forests, because that's essentially what we need to do if we're going to learn more about these ecosystems and more about the amazing properties that they have. Next slide. And the next slide, I'll just skip this one. And yeah, just to end, I would say that if you live along the coast, or if you spend time holidaying along the coast or traveling to the coast at any point, I would really invite you to go down to a rocky area and explore seaweed forests yourself. They are often obscure areas. Nobody really visits them or pays them any attention, but they are incredibly beautiful ecosystems. If you swim, even better. If you go to a tide pool during low tide, you can access it without having to swim. And India does have a huge diversity of seaweed. They support all of our fish stocks, and they really need more importance. But they're also incredibly beautiful spaces. And the longer I work with seaweed ecosystems, the more I want to conserve them, not only for the incredible value that they give to the ocean and now to people as well, but I think personally, very selfishly, I think I've been really changed by spending time in seaweed forests. And I really invite you to do the same. And yeah, I think they're really magical ecosystems that you absolutely should experience at some point. I guess I'll leave it open to Q&A, and I would really like to have a conversation more about nutrition and food. And if you ever want to try some of our products or reach out to me in any way, please do. I'm always excited to talk about seaweed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. As always, I think your optimism and your sort of passion for what you do is very infectious. I think like I did one seaweed, tide pool walk with you where we explored some of these seaweed forests, and I think I really felt that. And I think what I really enjoyed about this is that, like the more this industry scales up, the more it also affects, like in a positive way, conservation and wild species in the ocean. So that seems like like something that can be looked forward to, versus a lot of like scaling up that happens in other forms of agriculture where it can be quite like destructive. So I don't know, like, do you see this sort of going that way as well?
Yeah, that's
Or
a really good question. I don't know. I guess the short of it is that there's just not enough research to see how the seaweed industry will progress. There are a lot of conservationist approaches to it. So one of the best things to do really when it comes to the seaweed industry is to start mapping existing seaweed forests. We don't actually know the diversity we have yet. A lot of these seaweed forests have not been mapped, are not really photo documented, so we don't know how they're being impacted by climate change. But much like conserving wild seed or wild species of plants, in the same way, we really need to conserve wild species of seaweed. And that really helps us understand how these ecosystems function and understand how they can be resilient in the future. So that's one. But the other way to do it would really be to ensure coastal communities are engaged with seaweed farming in a way that is meaningful to their economic well-being. I think they're often marginalized when it comes to decision making, and they're the last people to know when it comes to when a seaweed farm is coming up, or what species is being grown. They do need to be part of the decision making process more, and I think that will set a precedent for future seaweed farms, because they will be coastal community driven, they will have local knowledge, and it's just better practice in general. And thirdly, I think I would say that there needs to be a lot more research when it comes to seaweed before we promote it as this one solution for everything. We just don't have enough research, but in general, with climate change, we don't have enough time. And so there has to be this balance between trying things out and experimenting, and also backing research as much as possible.
Right. I am aware that we just have 2 minutes left, but I just really wanted to like ask this question because I think the reason why I asked you about scaling up is because it really seems to me that there's so much potential in seaweed, especially in the conversation that we've been having, throughout the day about or what we're going to like sort of setting the tone for the next panel discussion as well about making vegan protein or vegan nutrition accessible. So, like you said, I think irrespective of how much protein we can derive from seaweed, there's definitely a lot of nutritional value, especially for vegans who may be having to supplement with other vitamins, which are naturally available in seaweed. So, it seems like a very exciting, future food, like you said, in terms of like using it to in our daily like food, like you said, and also like using it in a very like context specific way, like you said, in India pickles are a great way to sort of incorporate seaweed. Another, I just wanted to like, I remember this one thing that you and Chetan had mentioned in your workshop that I think a lot of people get deterred by seaweed because they think it smells fishy. But what you had said is that it is not that seaweed smells fishy, but fish smell seaweedy. So if people are deterred by that, I mean, what would you say to that? I don't know.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting because for I guess for someone, I come from a community that does consume seafood and has consumed seafood. The smell of fish is so intrinsic to, yeah, it's just you can't really describe it outside of if you haven't tasted fish. And so to tell someone that actually this flavor doesn't come from fish, it comes from seaweed, you can intellectualize it, but really you keep just tasting fish. Like that's the first thing a lot of people feel when they taste seaweed. It's like, oh, it's really fishy. And it's both a detriment, but also something that has worked in our favor. Some people really like fish flavor, and if they don't want to consume seafood anymore, seaweed becomes a really good alternative. And for those people who just don't consume seafood at all, we don't really talk about it in terms of the fishy flavor, but it's more about the umami flavor that comes out from seaweed. And all seaweeds have different flavor profiles. So if you eat nori, for example, the sheets, they have a very distinct, more intense flavor, whereas sargassum, which is another brown species, has a more briny flavor. The way I describe it is like if you go for a swim in the ocean and you gulp some seawater, that's sort of like a concentrated version of what this seaweed tastes like. And so some seaweed tastes like raw mango, for example. The spatoglossum that we have in one of the tide pools in Goa has this really distinct tart flavor. And that's really alien to anyone that has eaten anything from the sea. Nothing from the sea tastes like mango. But we have some species that have that flavor profile. And so we're tasked with this very difficult, I guess, but also interesting position of kind of defining new flavors that no one has tried before. And the only way to really do it is to get people down to the tide pool and hand them some seaweed and say, try it, and then tell me what you think about it.
I mean, I think that's a great note to sort of like great optimistic note to end it on. And as someone who's tasted like a couple of different iterations in sugar, in like pickles, and as a condiment, I think it's super versatile. I think the fishy flavor, like it doesn't really, there are many ways to get over it as well and use it as a very versatile product. So I'm personally very much looking forward to whatever like the future of this. I see there are a few questions that came up now in the chat, but unfortunately we don't have the time. But what I can do is like share these with Gabriella, and then you can either carry on the conversation with Gabriella, or I can pass on her answers to you. Thank you, Manisha and Deepak, for your questions. And I
would just like
you.
to say one thing. If you do want to start eating seaweed, while eating Indian seaweed is kind of difficult right now, you can source some from us. But if you just want to get onto Amazon, you can start eating nori, which is a very high nutritional seaweed. It does grow in India, but it's mostly grown in Korea and Japan. It's very high in B12, iodine, and a lot of very nutritional dense minerals and vitamins. And there's also a seaweed called wakame, which you can rehydrate and put into salads. That's another excellent seaweed. Again, it's also just available on Amazon. And kombu, which is another seaweed that you can eat right now. These are all not from India, unfortunately, but it's a great way to start eating seaweed, have more nutrition in your diet. And at some point of time, you can also start eating Indian seaweed if that's something that interests you.
Yeah, these are great recommendations. Thank you, Gabriella. And thank you for everyone in the chat who's been very interested in this. I think you can follow her and her organization on Instagram. And I guess reach out to her directly if you have any questions.